Good evening, everyone. My name is Meg Pierce. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. For your awareness, as you can see, this webinar is being recorded. However, it is a webinar, meaning your camera is off and no one can see you. A reminder that closed captioning is available in this Zoom webinar. To enable closed captions, it's pretty simple. Just click Live Transcript on your Zoom taskbar. And if you need any more assistance with closed captioning, we are dropping a help document in the chat. And please let us know if we can improve accessibility for you in any way. Just let us know using the Q&A function. A little bit about the League of Women Voters, who's the host of tonight's event. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our state office oversees a grassroots network of 33 local leagues all across Pennsylvania. The League encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy, which is why we're here tonight. To learn more about our work and to subscribe to our action alerts, please visit our website. We'll drop those links in the chat as well. I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to Ballot Box Basics, information every voter needs. We design these webinars because we recognize that elections and voting and government can be complicated. And these monthly webinars will discuss topics that we think all voters need to know, like registering to vote, voting integrity, election security, and constitutional amendments, which is why we're here tonight. And we believe that whether you're a first-time voter or if you voted in every single election that you were eligible for, we think you'll learn something new. And as always, we keep our website very updated with past recordings of Ballot Box Basics. So if you'd like to go back and review what you've missed from previous webinars, we will drop the link to that in the chat. So tonight is our last Ballot Box Basics before the general election. So thanks again for joining us. Tonight will feature a discussion of the Pennsylvania constitutional amendment process and how it works. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome and certainly encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A function of Zoom. So as soon as our panelist starts talking, please feel free to drop questions in the chat for her. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for Q&A. And I'm now happy to introduce Susan Gobreski, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania's Government Policy Director. Susan is a 25+ year career advocate focusing on campaign strategies and program development for improving public policy around equity, opportunity, and quality of life issues, such as economic opportunity, democracy, and education. Just a couple of things, right, Susan? That work has been centered on integrating policy analysis and implementation with public engagement and organizing, and has included extensive coalition work, issue-focused election engagement, and leadership development and training for individuals and organizations. At the League, Susan manages our extensive government policy portfolio, which includes voting rights, litigation, redistricting, and of course, constitutional amendments. Susan does so much for our organization, and I'm so excited that she's here to share with you, our members and supporters, more about this really important time. Susan, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And I really want to thank Meg and Rochelle and Sam, Anthony, who are here. We have an amazing team of people at the League of Women Voters. It's one of the biggest benefits of getting involved with the League is really being able to work with amazing, smart women across the state, across generations, across areas of issue interest. And so it's really, really a pleasure. Everyone's working hard. Rochelle is our newest chair of our voter services, and the Ballot Box Basics has been an incredible program this year. So anyway, I would like to say thank you to all of you and to everyone for being here. I know people are busy. This is actually kind of a hot topic. So I'm going to run through it. There will be time for questions, so go ahead and put them in the chat. And I'm going to see if I can do my best. Okay, Ballot Box Basics, amending the Pennsylvania Constitution. So few things. First of all, how do you amend the Pennsylvania Constitution? And I will share a link in a few minutes. We'll get some links here. But here it is in all of its glory. There's actually language about when it was amended, what the statutes are, et cetera. And if you start reading it, you can just pick any point. Such proposed amendment or amendments shall be entered on their journals with the yeas and nays taken thereon, and the secretary shall cause the same. So I made this slide instead. Wait, what? What does that say? So here are sort of some essentials that you need to know about how to amend the Constitution. And you can see that language. We will share the link. Pennsylvania has a biennial, which are 2-year sessions. Each 2-year period is a single session of the legislature. You will occasionally hear people talk about the legislature is in session or out of session, but that doesn't mean that they have ended a session and are starting a new one. It means they're in recess. Our session that is the length of their term, basically. The exact same language has to pass both the House and the Senate in each of 2 sessions. Once the legislature passes it, it has to be advertised in a newspaper in each county 3 times, 30 days apart is the way that that works. And then after it is passed twice, so once in each of 2 sessions, then it goes to the voters. A few additional notes here. Proposals to change the Constitution are resolutions, not legislation, and therefore are not subject to a veto. And when something is placed on the ballot, like when the legislature puts it on the ballot, after that, all those requirements happen, has the ability to affect whether or not something passes. Not it has passed, whether or not it will pass. Sorry, I was pushed myself a little bit too late here. So just for those of you who are visual, this is how it works. Has to pass the House and the Senate. I could make this much more complicated, like pass the House and the Senate. It goes back and forth, but it has to pass both of them. And there's way more weeds here. There's way more detail. I'm happy to unpack any of it after we get through the top lines. It's advertised, then it gets passed in a second session, has to go at least 90 days, and then it goes to the voters, right? So that's sort of at its simplest form. And people are like, so it has to go to the voters, is that bad? And the answer is, of course not. Of course it's not bad to include the voters in a process to change the Constitution, but changing the Constitution is a big deal. That is enacting something and enshrining something into essentially a foundational document on which we base the law and decisions. People decide whether or not something's constitutional based on what's in the Constitution. So it is not really meant to be a legislative document. That's why we have legislation. It's meant to be a constitution, and it's supposed to be hard to change. It's supposed to stand the test of time. So it's bad when you're doing it to do things like try and do things that you can't do by legislation. So it's totally appropriate. We'll talk about some of the provisions of one of the current amendments that we're talking about. If you want to change whether or not the voters elect a statewide office like lieutenant governor, whether or not the voters decide to give away their power or assign it to somebody else or keep it, that's reasonable. But it shouldn't be done instead of legislation. We'll talk about that in a second. And we shouldn't be holding ballot measures to take away or prohibit rights. Constitutions usually protect rights, not explicitly prevent them. So lots of recent proposals are more appropriate for legislation. So one of the things the legislature is now talking about is enacting voter ID into our Constitution because the governor vetoed legislation that had a proposal for it. So because the governor is not involved and we have a divided government, the legislature has taken to proposing constitutional amendments instead of legislation. So that's a deficiency. And that gets covered in a lot of the news coverage about that. But so when you start talking about things like what kind of ID is appropriate, that's something that might change. The kinds of ID that people have, security measures on different IDs, those are all reasonable considerations where you might want that to be legislation. Again, if the legislature, we have a system of checks and balances, the legislature passes legislation, the governor, who's elected by people across Pennsylvania, has the right to veto it. The legislature has the opportunity to override a veto. And there are reasons that we have these systems. So trying to do an end run around it is really not great governing. Timing has become an issue with some of these. So the other issue here is we're making these decisions, but they're not going to the ballot, for example, every 2 years when there's higher turnout, or every 4 years when there's the highest turnout. It can go in a primary in a municipal year. That's what it'll be next year. The May primary next year will be municipal elections and probably lower turnout, and even November will be municipal. In fact, next year might be higher turnout in some cases because, for example, Philadelphia, the state's largest city, has contested gubernatorial or mayoral election and city council. So people might say, well, we don't want it then, because then there'll be lots of people in Philadelphia turning out. So really these types of things should give us pause about what the process is, who's using it, and how they're using it. And voters have tended to say yes. Now, sometimes people scoff at that. I tend to be kinder. I think what happens is that the language is, in an effort to make the language sound neutral, it often makes it sound agreeable, if that makes sense, right? That's sort of a function of trying to make something sound neutral and trying to, so you can try to affect the wording of something by making it very dramatic and sound very scary, or you can make, like, well, something terrible is going to happen. Sounds not so bad if you say it in a calm voice with certain types of words. So we have to consider that. As a result of that effort to keep to neutral wording, voters have tended to say yes. And I'll be the first to admit, I consider myself to be pretty well informed. And I've been like, sure, that sounds like a good idea. And I'm sure it wouldn't have made it this far unless reasonable people thought it was a good idea. So I'll say yes, why not? And now I'm ashamed. But anyway, so one of the other pieces of all of that, this is that one of the things we are going to need to do individually and then collectively as civic actors is learn to become more educated and more discerning voters when it comes to ballot measures. And that might be a possible good of this overreach on constitutional amendments. But there are lots and lots of amendments. As we mentioned, this became sort of a political tool in a toolbox. Over 70 constitutional amendments were proposed in the past 2 years. I will again share a link, or if someone wants to look up the PA Spotlight's guide to all constitutional amendments and post that link, I would love that help at this moment. But anyway, and they have put a tracker together. Hardly any of them made it through the process. So we have Senate Bill 106, which we're going to talk about in a second. So again, this is something that went from being a fairly serious and not often used endeavor to something that has become both a sort of political strategy tool and a threat in some cases, like agree on legislation or we'll go to a constitutional amendment, and voters are going to say yes. So that is one of the things that we are working to avoid. So then on top of all of that, sort of the principled reasons that this is a concern to watch, we can get into some specifics. So Senate Bill 106, I'm sorry, this is not a great slide. I would just like to acknowledge that it is not an aesthetically pleasing slide, but it does get at the essence. So we're going to talk about I was supposed to do this first. Bad process and bad policy, sorry. It's supposed to blink at you, but the legislature, generally speaking, wraps up and gets ready to go into recess. They pass a budget by the end of June. Sometimes they go a little bit over, and then they go home for the summer. They go into recess, not end session. So they're supposed to be done with the session that they're in by June 30th. Well, our legislature did not pass a budget by June 30th. They hung around for another week. And then on Friday, July 7th, 8th, they actually finally passed a budget. And then after having said that they were not going to take up Senate Bill 106, including to the Senate minority leader, they brought up Senate Bill 106, which was originally just about the position of lieutenant governor. But along the way, language had been added to Senate Bill 106 that included the provisions that we're about to talk about. Furthermore, they actually had to suspend the rules because they have legislation. They have a rule that now says they can't vote on things after 11 p.m. That came after they voted for a pay raise for themselves in the middle of the night, costing a number of legislators their jobs over a decade ago, more than a decade ago. So they had to suspend the rules. And so they passed a series of constitutional amendments in one package after 11 o'clock on a Friday night, a week after they were supposed to have gone home for the summer. Not very transparent, not very open. The public, even people who are monitoring it, part of the rules of our Constitution actually provide a number of provisions so that people can have access to what our elected officials are doing. Even in that first slide that I shared, and again, we will put the link to the Constitution up, it actually says people have to be able to see the yays and nays. And so what we got was a report from them on how they voted, and I'll come back to that. Not a transparent process, it was pretty late at night. Somebody jokingly called it the midnight rights raiders. So these are the 5 provisions in Senate Bill 106, and we oppose them all for good reasons. Now, some of them, one of them at least, one of them is a legitimate topic for a constitutional amendment, which I'll talk about. That's the last one and the subject of the original bill. But it declares that the state constitution does not grant any right relating to abortion, and that there's no right to public funding for a procedure. So as a quick point of analysis here, 1, this is taking away a right, using a constitution to ban a right. 2, it is targeting a segment of the population that can get pregnant. So essentially targeting a class of people. And it actually deals with 2 subjects. Senate Bill 106 had 5 different amendments proposed, and you can actually perhaps deal with multiple amendments in a single, multiple constitutional amendments proposed in a single resolution, but each constitutional amendment has to be a single subject. And so the question here is whether or not this is in fact a single subject. So that is a problem with the in addition to our opposition to the policy issue, that is a basis for opposing the amendment because of the way that it does not deal with a single subject. In fact, polling shows that lots of people support people's right to get an abortion, and lots of people support no taxpayer funding. So, people might actually hold 2 different views on that. And so, you might have people going in and voting on that issue and deciding either way based on what they think is the more important emphasis on that. So that's an issue. It would also give the legislature power to stop any regulation with a simple majority. So if the governor uses their administrative and executive power, to issue a regulation, which is currently one of the powers that they have, they would be able to stop it with a simple majority, not even like an override of a veto. And it would not be subject to a governor's signature or veto. So it's basically shifting power from the governor and shifting it to the legislature, giving itself more power that it does not currently have, taking it away from another branch. It would create additional voter ID requirements in a state with that already has voter ID. This is an issue that is very near and dear to the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. We've litigated about this. Again, lots of people actually do, when you look at public opinion, people support the concept of voter ID. So it becomes, sometimes people say, well, like, what's the big deal? So here's what the big deal is. 1, it matters a lot what kind of ID is acceptable. So lots of people have student IDs. If you say, for example, a gun license is okay and a student ID is not, you are making decisions about who has the kinds of, and not everyone has a driver's license. And some people actually don't have easy access to their birth certificate. It gets lost along the way. It's challenging to get a copy. It might be challenging to get into a system where you get a particular kind of state issued ID. So currently we have ID requirements that require somebody to provide ID, a proof of identity, when they register to vote and when they go to vote at a polling place for the first time. So if you're a new voter and you go to vote, you have to show ID for the first time that you're in that polling place. If you are moving, if you've moved and you've never been in a polling place before, you have to show ID. So I could have voted 30 times and then move. But if I'm in a new polling place, a new division, then I show ID to confirm my identity. And part of that is based on the idea that people who are local are actually in polling places. And so once you've been there and you are a neighbor, a known entity, but you've shown ID, you've proven yourself, that person had to show ID to register. They had to show ID the first time they voted here. And now they are considered a voter. And you have to actually validate your ID when you do a vote by mail. So again, this can have, and the poor people with less money, less resources, who also actually have the right to vote, are the people most likely to be harmed. And that includes populations and sometimes in certain communities. So that can have an untoward effect. It would require that elections be audited by the Auditor General. And you might be like, oh, Auditor General, great, audit, sounds reasonable. But here's a few things. One, that actually sets up a constitutional, first of all, it's based on this idea that elections have to be audited and cannot be trusted, despite the fact that right now there is not evidence of substantial there's really not evidence of voter fraud, but certainly nothing widespread. Normally what you would say is, hey, there have been all these cases that were brought to law enforcement and had to be prosecuted. We seem to have a widespread problem, but based on no evidence, this is all part of this drumbeat around our elections cannot be trusted. And that's a problem because, again, we want to be able to use evidence. Second, it creates a crisis because we actually have a department that deals with elections. The Auditor General was set up as a financial department. And so these are not people who are trained in election systems, election security, et cetera. So, and it could actually slow the process up or potentially create a crisis. There's that. And so giving constitutional authority to a different department poses a lot of challenges and questions. And then it changes the selection process to lieutenant governor. Now, here's what the proposal is. It would change it from being elected by voters to being appointed by the party in the same way right now that the vice president is. So again, a lot of people might have say like, that's no big deal. I personally would say if you're taking power away from voters to give it to a party, not really a big fan of taking power away from voters. But certainly, we do have a model for that. It's a legitimate discussion. So I think there's concerns there. I'll pause there and see if I actually do not see the chat. I'll see if there are any questions, but then or should I just keep going and then do questions at the end?
Yeah, I'm watching for questions, Susan, in the Q&A. None have come in so far. So I say keep going and we'll save them for the end. But
Great.
Yeah, just a reminder, everyone, use the Q&A to ask questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so what happens next with it? It is currently in the process of being advertised, which I'm going to talk about in a second. It could get taken up anytime between January of 2023 and August of 2024. So it'll just be sitting out there. Like they can say, there can be legislators who say like, oh, we don't have any interest in taking that up. And it can just sit there. And then like they did with Senate Bill 106 the first time, they could do it, late on a Friday night at the last minute. And so it'll be just looming. And then after 90 days, it will become a ballot measure on the next election. So there could be efforts to watch what the public mood is or turnout or how contested elections are. I'm going to come back to that advertisement thing, and don't let me forget, that was the graphic I was looking for. But so I want to actually just talk about how we stop it. And I'm going to talk about sort of a couple of phases, and I'm going to talk about litigation as well. So the first issue is accountability, right? Which is that the legislature has to know, and they have heard that people are ticked off and not happy either about the process or about the substance. After the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court around abortion rights, lots of people are fired up about abortion. So the legislature actually may want to wait until that fury has died down. We've actually also heard that there may be interest in trying to not pass all those 5 amendments together again as a package. which could then sort of de-emphasize some of the frustration that people have. Not good phrasing, but hopefully you got my drift, which is trying to make it easier to get it passed and not draw people's anger at the process or the package deal. So there's accountability, and then they'll be opposing it, advancing through the next session. So that means really lobbying. We're going to need to make sure that legislatures just don't want to vote for it because they understand. Sorry, my dogs are saying hello. That they understand that people are not happy about it, but that is hard to maintain for a year and a half or a year and 8 months. So those are the issues that we're going to have to be watching for, and that is what the supporters are going to be watching for as well. They know that it's going to be hard for people to stay mad for 18 months, especially when there's so much other mischief to get mad about, which I'm sure we'll see. And then what we're going to need to do if it gets to that point, if it actually gets passed, is we're going to need to stop it from passing on the ballot. Again, ideally, we'd want to avoid that. We'd want to stop it before it gets there, which takes us to litigation. So this is where I was going to have my thing, which I'll explain in a second. So the League of Women Voters has actually, the governor petitioned the court to take up this issue that the passage of this bill was so problematic that it should not be allowed to move forward, and the court needs to stop it. They did it on a couple of grounds. One is this issue of the abortion rights and the single subject rule. As we were evaluating it, the other thing that emerged is that the following: the legislature, Pennsylvania's constitution actually currently has old language saying that you have to be 21 years old to vote, and that you have to be a resident of your community of Pennsylvania for 90 days and of the community that you vote in for 60 days. The 26th Amendment actually has changed the voting age, so rendering Pennsylvania's language moot, right? That doesn't count anymore because now the US Constitution says you only have to be 18 to vote. But Pennsylvania still has this vestigial language. And then the Voting Rights Act actually said that long residency requirements are also a problem. So it's a 30-day residency requirement. Now, why does that matter if the federal law says that it's only 30 days and you have to be 18 to vote? Well, because of this vestigial language in Pennsylvania, when the constitutional amendment package was advertised, what was advertised is this old language. So it says, shall we change the Constitution of Pennsylvania to read, you have to be 21 years old to vote, and you have to be, it actually included the language, this old vestigial language, as they talked about the parts below it, saying, can we change this part of the Constitution with the bad language, the old language, to read this with the new language that was proposed? And the effect of that is that in every paper, or in a newspaper in every county in Pennsylvania, right now there are ads running that say you have to be 21 years old to vote and you have to have been a resident for 90 days. Now we know that that's not actually the case, but if you are reading that, you might misunderstand that that maybe that's the proposal to change the Constitution, or that is the current rule. Maybe you understand that is the proposal to change the Constitution is that section, but you might think, wait, I guess that's the current rule. I thought I only had to be a 30-day residence, but I guess I don't. I guess I won't vote because you have to be a 90-day resident because I just read it in the paper. Now, do people read the paper? Actually, it turns out the answer is still yes. And if the requirement is that it has to be advertised, then we have to take that at face value and treat it as if it counts. So right now, the required advertising has the bizarre effect of being an act of misinformation that's being repeated in every county in Pennsylvania. The other issue that I can go back to it just so folks see it if you are inclined to read it, but this language right here, one of the pieces that you'll see is that it says that you have to be able to see the yays and nays, which I referenced. Now, as it stands, we can see the yays and nays on how every member of the legislature voted on the entire package of Senate Bill 106 in the Senate or when the House concurred on it. But what we can't see is how they voted on each of the different sections, right? And this is part of what the governor points out as well. You can't see if we have legislators who say, I didn't support the abortion, but I did support the voter ID and the audit. You can't tell the difference right now. As far as they're concerned, everyone who voted yes supported all of these, and everyone who voted no opposed all of these. However, if our legislators are out there in the community saying that they do not wholeheartedly support all of this, that's a problem. That exactly makes the point that we were supposed to be able to tell what their positions were. So furthermore, if any of you hear any legislator anywhere saying that they had different positions on some of these amendments, I urge you to get in contact with us immediately. But we also have several young people. Part of our coalition work includes working with people who work with young people. We had several young people actually joined us in petitioning to intervene in this lawsuit, which we are refiling. We will be pursuing our legal options as we move forward because they found the advertisement very confusing and not clear, and it did not tell them. The one other aspect to this is one of the things we know with the Dobbs ruling on abortion rights is that the Supreme Court will consider taking rights that are long established away, which would make state language very much, would actually make it matter very much. Now, because we have the 26th Amendment, the voting age will stay 18. But if the Constitution, if a case went to the United States Supreme Court and the Constitution decided to upend the historical rules around residency requirements, we could end up having this, in fact, end up as almost a trigger law. I would note that if you have a 90-day residency requirement, you are essentially discriminating against people who are not discriminating in the sense of you are actually disenfranchising people who move in August and September. And that actually also happens to apply to a great number of young people who live on a school year calendar. And again, I will pull up this, stop, pause that share. How do I go back to my PowerPoint? Okay, am I back to it?
Yeah, you're all set.
Okay, so then that's where we're at. Why are we litigating? We are litigating because we don't think this legislation or the resolution passed a good quality test of good government. We are concerned about both the process and the effect of the way that this process is being implemented, in addition to having opposition to a lot of the proposals. So that's my presentation. I know that I didn't use up my whole time, but I'm still going to stop there, answer any questions, and let folks say what they have to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. Super informative. You want to unshare your screen and then we can.
Yes, please.
And then we can take questions. Okay, great. I've seen a couple come in. They're all really awesome questions. I'll start with one that came in first. So someone asked, what rights do independent voters have if the amendments were to be put on the ballot during the May primary?
Right. Excellent point. Excellent question. And the answer is that they have every right to vote, and they will. They can vote on that, but a lot of independent voters don't go to the primary because they think they are, so they may either not be aware or following. The independent voters are allowed to vote on ballot questions. You only have to choose a party. You only get to vote in party elections, though, if you are a registered member of one of the two major parties. So they would be allowed to vote, but a lot of them won't go to vote because they think there's nothing there, or they decide it's not worth it, or they're unaware that something is being posted on the ballot. So that actually also would have a potential huge impact on turnout and participation.
Yep, excellent point. So we had another question. What will organizations like the League do if this were to make it to the ballot? So obviously we're going to be focusing all of our efforts on informing voters, trying to get this to not pass a second section of the legislature. But if we fail, what is our role going to be going forward if this were to be a ballot question?
That's a good question. Ballot campaigns are often expensive, but the League has been very clear that we are going to use every tool in our toolbox and every resource available to us to fight things that we oppose. And so we will be, if it does make it to the ballot, past litigation and the other processes, I think we would be garnering our resources and wherewithal. One thing to note about this is that that I think is interesting is that when something goes to the ballot, when a policy issue goes to the ballot, a ballot measure, it's actually not election work, it's lobbying, because the public becomes the legislators, right? So because they're actually making a policy decision, so we would be doing lobbying. There are some campaign finance implications to that, so we would take a look at what our options are and what our resources are, and fight like hell.
Yes, we will. So a question from Teresa. She wants to clarify, has SB 106 passed both houses during one session? So I think she wants to know, just to reiterate the process, how does it work to have two different sessions?
Okay, so what has to happen is it starts in one house or the other. So in this case, it started in the Senate. Senate Bill 106 was passed by the Senate and then gets sent to the House. And if they vote for the exact same language, it has to be the exact same language, then it's passed both houses, right? Both sections of the General Assembly. And then it has to go to both houses again. It can start in either, as long as the exact same legislation, exact same language is passed in both the House and the Senate next session, then it will have met all of the requirements for passing both houses in both sessions.
And it's hard to understand and difficult to understand for a reason, right? Like I think this is all adding, to why the lawmakers are trying to do it this way, because it's complicated, it's convoluted, and they can sneak things by us.
If the language, I do see one question, if the language doesn't pass as a package. So there is a question about this, right? So I think the thinking is that if they could pass each of them as long as each section is the same. So if the part on abortion is exactly the same, they can move it forward, even if they cut off the other four, for example. That is what people believe. Yeah.
So we have another question from Darlene. This is about voter ID. So she asks, if a first-time voter has no ID, registers with the last 4 digits of her social security number, does she still need photo ID at her first time at the polls?
So the answer is yes. You have to show one of the identified forms of the provided forms of identification, which I can find in a second. But yes, yes, you still have to provide ID when you go to the polls.
Thank you. Diana asked, if the legislature does not pass the 5 as a package, does that mean that they go away because they will not have met the requirement for identical language?
No, so if they pass, as long as each section had I am not, let me just say this, I should have said this at the beginning, I am not a lawyer. And I am actually not even a constitutional expert yet. So what it is my understanding is that there is at least an operating theory that they could pass each of the provisions separately as long as the language is exactly the same. So it is not clear that it would have to be all 5 together again at the exact same time because of that single subject rule. So as I understand it, the law says you can pass a resolution calling for multiple constitutional amendments, but the amendments have to go to the ballot separately. You have to have a single subject when they go to the voters. But it is being challenged about whether or not you actually can pass them as a package in one resolution because of this issue of yeas or nays. The Constitution makes it very clear that the intent is that the voters should be able to see how their elected officials voted on these things. And so again, especially if we hear of any legislators differentiating their position on some of these ballot measures, we would want to hear that.
Thank you. So we have a comment and a question from Teresa. She says, this is so informative. I'm new to the league. Welcome, Teresa. So glad to have you. She asks, how will the league be getting the word out to voters on these ballot issues?
I feel like that's a Rochelle and Meg question, but I'm happy to talk.
Sure, I can kick it off and maybe we can go from there. So we are doing all we can to help voters realize, sorry, my dog is barking really loud. Sorry about that. So the first thing that we're doing is just information sharing. We actually have a petition going right now for people to take action against these amendments, and I'm going to drop that in the chat. We're also encouraging folks to get the word out in their communities. So write a letter to the editor, share our resources, post on social media about this, whether that's sharing our petition directly or putting it in your own words why this matters to you. So again, getting the word out, trying to educate as many people as we can, because this process is convoluted and complicated, and it's that way for a reason. So we want to try to do everything we can early before this goes to the ballot. I don't know, Rochelle, if you want to add anything to that.
No, you said it beautifully.
Great. Susan, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. I don't know if that's you.
Is it still me?
I think we're good.
Okay. I can see the questions now. So I'm gonna ask Connie's question, which is no, there's no way to find out how each legislator voted on. Oh yes, there is a way to find out how they voted on the resolution. We will get the link and post it so you can see it. But you can't see how they voted on each of the provisions. It was a yes or no to the package. So that's that, and I'll find the link and post that one in a moment. And yes, to Diana's question about the Senate bill's abortion amendment is actually two questions. We agree, the governor agrees, lots of people are raising that issue that there are two separate subjects in that provision. So I think that this is not the last you'll hear of the two topics of that.
And then Susan, if you wouldn't mind just reading the question out loud, just because people can't see the question.
Oh.
You can. Yeah.
I'm
happy to also read them to you, whatever works.
Great. So we have one question. Please explain the differences between what the lobbying arm of the league can do versus what the voter services and education arm of the league can do with respect to constitutional amendments, assuming they pass. So a couple of things. One, organizations, there are two typical kinds of nonprofit advocacy organizations. There are 501c3s, which is focused on education and services, and 501c4s, which actually are social welfare organization, but they are allowed to do lobbying, unlimited lobbying. And 501c3s can only do limited lobbying. So what we will be doing is looking at what which of the organizations that are part of our family of organizations are the right vehicle, and where we have resources, because that's what matters, and using the resources appropriately and in accordance with funding restrictions to be able to do public education about the issues, and to let people know what we think is at stake and what their options are as voters. We want to make sure a driving goal for us is informed voters. And so making sure that people have information. And then to the degree that we're able to, we will advocate for a specific position. And again, it's lobbying, but there are, because it happens on an election calendar and in a venue of an election, there will be a couple of issues there. But both of our arms of the organization are going to be able to engage in this conversation and the efforts to educate the public about this.
Another great question we had, Susan, was what advice do you have for talking to friends and family members about this in a way that's accessible? Because as we talked about, it's really complicated, but also productive.
Excellent question. So a couple of quick thoughts are one, there's actually there's a lot of work being done to help find out what moves people and what helps people understand issues and not feel like it's too complicated. And so one is being solution oriented, right? And when you're thinking about things like actually helping to get people out to vote, I'll come back to Senate Bill 106 in a second. But when you're thinking about things like helping to get people out to vote, one of the things you want to do is really help people talk about whether or not they have actually information. Do they know where they're going to vote? For example, if we were, for example, in 2023 and trying to get people to turn out and say no to something, we'd say, do you know, this is on the ballot. Do you know where to vote? Do you know what you're going to, what you're going to vote on? Have you gotten a chance to read the question? Really helping to draw people into the process and making it sound accessible. So making it sound easy. The short version, I think right now, and what I found is that right now, a lot of people want the long version, but the short version is really, there was a really problematic process to pass controversial amendments that the legislature has been looking towards changing the Constitution because to avoid the veto. That's not really the way we want legislation to get done in the Commonwealth. And so, and furthermore, there are specific provisions, including a ban that would make sure that the Constitution says there's no right to an abortion. And by the way, that's designed to deal with a court case that's going through the process right now, where part of the case that's being made is that our Constitution does have the right to an abortion. So they're like, wait, hold on, we want to change it and make sure it says no before that court case gets decided. And so saying, I personally talk about where you come from, what your story is, I, Susan, believe in the right to an abortion. I believe that that is a right. I don't believe the Constitution should take away rights. I have questions about, I understand why somebody wants to change the position of lieutenant governor from elected to appointed by the party, but I like being able to vote. That's the person who backs up the governor. I like having the vote for that, you could say, I don't understand the audit thing, or I think the Department of State should be the place that deals with elections. We have an agency ready to deal with that. I'd like to leave it there. I don't want to see things get more complicated. So find a simple explanation, explain it, ask people if you can help them get more information. The League, Meg has put a lot of time in, and Sam have put time into helping make sure that we have language available to people explaining the issues.
And one thing, Susan, that struck me that I think maybe we haven't fully gotten into is why this process is being used as opposed to actually making laws related to these specific issues. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big issue is, as I said, we have a divided government. The legislature is of one party, the governor is of another party, and the legislature has been frustrated by by things going to the governor for veto. And so they have started to look around for a maneuver procedure that allows them to evade the governor's veto. And there are, there are other efforts underway, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country to change the way that powers are allocated in state government, including to give, in general, including to give state legislatures more power and to take authority away from both the courts and the executive branches. And we are concerned about that. We're working with the National League to monitor those issues both here in Pennsylvania and to find out what's happening in other states. Some of these issues, unfortunately, there's been a shift, and we have gone from a country where the goal was a fair fight and a contest of ideas on a fair fight, and then we agreed to win or lose sometimes, right? That's part of our deal. I agree that you get to win sometimes if I get to win sometimes, right? If we get to take our case to the people. But now we're getting to the point where we have things like legislatures who are people who are saying that they won't publicly agree to honor the results of an election. And it's disturbing. I kind of can't believe that I'm saying this, but we also have situations where legislatures are trying to give themselves more power and take it away from other branches, take away power from the courts, penalize. I mean, there have been cases where we have to watch for things like budgets, like the legislature has the budgeting authority. So if they take budgets away, then courts don't have the ability to operate and get backed up, and then people lose faith in them. So, I think we're also in a phase where it's really important to both express our frustration with government, but also our belief that government is an important tool in the toolbox of society, right? Of how we live together. We don't, there are no such things as, there's really no such thing as them, right? We're all people who, drive on the roads and want food for our families in our community. We want people to be able to coach soccer and earn a living and make sure that their kids have healthcare. And so, I think we have to really think about what do we do to make sure that we're showing our commitment to democracy, to communities being able to work things out, to being able to peacefully disagree and not need to win at all costs, but be willing to go through a process together. So I think that's really important. Sorry about that soapbox. Wow, I just went, woo!
No, I think that was a really nice way to kind of tie a bow on everything you've said, Susan. Really well put. We finished with Q&A, but is there anything else you'd like to just end with before I pass it back to Rochelle to close us out?
Yes, I do want to end with one more thing, which is that the need for action. And Meg actually posted our action network here, which is both sending a letter or a note, but actually, I'd really like to encourage people to call their elected officials and say, that you're frustrated and angry about this, and that you are unhappy with where this is. And if you are, don't say it if that's not what you're feeling. Letters to the editor in your local paper can actually have a huge impact on the way that other people feel. Seeing support. One of the things we're learning, for example, about abortion is that more people are coming forward and telling their personal stories, which destigmatizes it for other people. And actually helps build public support, right? When they know that their sister and mother and friend had an abortion, the legal and safe. And if you're like, I'm 55, my mother tells a number of stories about her friends who went and got illegal abortions and were in danger because of it. So telling our stories is really important. And so sharing our individual views, you don't have to write a letter to the editor about an abortion, but writing a letter to the editor about your views on whether or not Pennsylvania's constitution should be used to ban that right, about your views on whether or not we should make people jump through hoops to vote. Those things are important. So we really want to encourage you to speak up in ways that can be heard by other people. The one other thing I'll say is that social media, we sort of went through several phases together as a world around social media, or as Americans, where there was, we started getting on Facebook, lots of people shared lots of things. The algorithms all happened, and now we don't see as much. I see a lot of advertisement for cool bags because apparently I like them, and groups, but not as much personal posts. But the more we share some of these things on social media, the more the algorithm will recognize them as authentic and worthy of being seen by other people. So I would encourage people to share some of the league's content on social media so that we can actually get it around in our own circles more, because you are the trusted messenger in your world. People will look to you. And so better than hearing from me is hearing from you.
I love that. Thank you so much, Susan. Rochelle, I will pass it over to you to close us
Okay.
out.
Well, Susan, this has just been a stellar presentation. It's a phenomenal way to end our series of Ballot Box Basics on this very, very important topic. You have given me a lot of food for thought, and I sit on your government policy committee and the constitutional amendments group. There is just always more to learn about this process. I would invite those of you that are doing candidate forums for your state house members or candidates that are running, and state senate candidates running, to ask the question about SB 106 and this joint resolution. If one of your candidates is an incumbent who got to vote on this, ask, did you vote on it? How did you vote? And why did you vote the way you did? If in some of our districts, there are two new folks, because these are new districts, it's a legitimate question, non-biased question, to explain that when you become elected, one of the things you're going to be asked to vote for is SB 106. You can divide it up into the different provisions. Do you support, oppose, And please explain. Those are legitimate questions to ask in your candidate forum. Having said that, we are going to have another Ballot Box Basics series in 2023. It will be focused on the municipal elections, the judicial elections, the local state government elections, so we can educate voters on what they're going to be voting for. If this ends up on the ballot, you can be sure that I'm going to be asking Susan Gobreski to do another presentation on what we need to understand about this, because it will be either in the May primary or the general election in 2023, or, as she said, in the 2024 elections. So if any of you have any suggestions on what you'd like to see for the 2023 Ballot Box Basics series, please let me know. Voter services at PALWV.org. And then I would be remiss, I would be fired from my job if I didn't talk for 2 seconds on Vote 411. That is the jewel of the League of Women Voters. It is the one-stop shop for voter information. You get on that website and you can find out anything you want to know about the upcoming election, including the deadlines for registration, mail-in ballot apps, when the mail-in ballot is due. There will be links to the Department of State or to your county voter registration through the Department of State, so you can register to vote, apply for a mail-in ballot, tell other people where they can go. There's candidate information. So every person who is running for State House, State Senate, congressional districts, governor, lieutenant governor, and US Senate has been asked to submit their biographical data and answer questions that the league has created. It is their answers are on Vote 411. So if anyone wants to know how their candidate stands, what their candidate's background is, it is on there. If in fact your candidate has not your candidate necessarily that you're supporting, but the candidate running in your district has not responded to Vote 411, you get a chance to bing them and say, I want you to respond. I could be a constituent. I want to know more information about you before I decide how I'm going to vote. From my personal opinion, if a candidate doesn't bother responding, I would think twice about giving them my precious vote. There is also finally information on candidate forums. So basically what happens, you put your address in, your ballot comes out with the positions, the names of the people, then you will see whether there's a candidate forum for that position in your area. So it's just a brilliant voter resource tool. So with that, I'm actually 1 minute before 7. I want to thank everybody for attending and asking such brilliant questions. And I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.